Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absolutely delightful world of medieval dental care, where a simple toothache wasn't just an inconvenience, it was your personal invitation to meet your maker. We're talking about an era that perfected the art of turning minor mouth pain into a full-blown death sentence, complete with rusty pliers, frog sacrifices, and medical advice that would make a modern dentist weep into their sterilized instruments. So before we get started, hit that like button if you enjoy learning about humanity's spectacular failures in healthcare, and subscribe if you want more stories about how our ancestors turned everyday problems into elaborate torture scenarios. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It's always wild to see who's brave enough to join me for these journeys into historical suffering. Now grab something soft to eat while you still can, maybe dim the lights, and let's settle in for tonight's tale of medieval mouth misery. Because after this story, you'll never complain about a dental cleaning again. So, you think a toothache is bad now? Oh, sweet summer child, you have absolutely no idea what bad actually looks like. Picture this, it's a Tuesday in 1347. Somewhere in what will eventually become France, but is currently just a collection of mud, desperation, and the lingering scent of unwashed humanity. You're a perfectly ordinary peasant, which means you own nothing, know nothing, and your greatest life achievement so far has been not dying of something horrible by age 25. Your days consist of farming turnips, avoiding tax collectors, and pretending to understand Latin when the priest mumbles through Mass. Then it happens, that tiny, insignificant twinge in your back molar. The one you've been ignoring for weeks because, let's be honest, you've got bigger problems. Like the fact that your roof leaks, your children are hungry, and the lord of the manor just decided he needs more money for his third mistress's new dress. But this little ache, this microscopic rebellion in your mouth, is about to become the star of your very own medieval horror story. You see, in medieval Europe, a toothache wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death warrant written in nerve endings and signed by a universe that had already decided you didn't deserve nice things. And before you could even begin to comprehend the full scope of your dental doom, you had to navigate the absolutely delightful world of medieval medicine, where the cure was often worse than the disease, and the disease was usually fatal anyway. Let's start with the basics. Medieval teeth were not having a good time. Your diet, if you were lucky enough to have one, consisted primarily of bread so coarse it could double as sandpaper. All that was basically liquid bread, and whatever protein you could catch, kill, or steal. This bread, your daily sustenance, was ground with stone mills that left lovely little granite particles embedded in every loaf. So every meal was essentially an aggressive tooth filing session conducted by tiny rocks with a personal vendetta against your enamel. The wealthy folks had access to sugar, which had recently arrived from the exotic East at prices that would make modern cocaine dealers weep with envy. Sugar was so precious that rich people would literally display it at dinner parties as a status symbol. Look at me, their rotting teeth seemed to say, I'm rich enough to destroy my mouth with imported sweetness. The poor stuck to honey when they could get it, which was about as often as they could afford a vacation to Jerusalem. But here's where it gets interesting. Rich or poor, once that tooth started hurting, you were entering uncharted territory where medical knowledge met creative sadism and decided to have a party. Medieval dental care was what happened when you combined complete ignorance of germ theory with an impressive collection of rusty tools and an unshakable belief that pain was probably God's way of testing your faith. Your first stop on the journey to dental hell would be the local barber. Not because he knew anything about teeth, mind you, but because he owned sharp objects and wasn't particularly squeamish about blood. The medieval barber was essentially a one-stop shop for all your medical needs, provided your medical needs included haircuts, tooth extractions, bloodletting, and the occasional amputation. His qualifications included steady hands and the ability to remain upright while his patients screamed. The barber's toolkit was a thing of nightmares. Imagine pliers designed by someone who had heard a vague description of pliers, but had never actually seen them. These extraction devices looked like they were forged in hell by a demon with a grudge against molars. They had no real grip, no precision, and absolutely no concern for the surrounding tissue. The barber would essentially grab your tooth with these medieval torture devices and yank until something gave way, whether it was the tooth, your jaw, or your will to live. But before he got to the yanking, there was the matter of pain management. Anesthesia in medieval times consisted of three options: alcohol, prayer, and biting down on a leather strap. The alcohol was usually ale or wine, administered in quantities that ranged from barely buzzed to unconscious but still technically breathing. The prayer was directed at whatever saint was currently taking requests for dental emergencies, though most saints seemed to have their hands full with more pressing matters like plagues and invasions. The leather strap was your last line of defense against screaming so loudly that you'd alert every demon in a 3-mile radius that fresh suffering was available. Now, if you were incredibly lucky, your barber might have some additional techniques in his arsenal. He might apply heated oil to your gums, which sounds soothing until you realize that medieval heating meant boiling, and medieval application meant dumping. He might pack your mouth with herbs like cloves or willow bark, which actually contained compounds that could numb pain, though he had no idea why they worked, and often mixed them with other substances that definitely didn't work, like crushed pearls or powdered unicorn horn. Some barbers believed in the theory of humoral imbalance, which suggested that all illness was caused by too much or too little of various bodily fluids. A toothache, they reasoned, was obviously caused by an excess of hot, wet humours concentrating in your jaw. The solution: bloodletting, of course. They would slice open a vein in your arm or neck and drain blood until you either felt better or passed out, whichever came first. Sometimes they would apply leeches directly to your gums, creating a delightful scene where blood-sucking worms wreathed around your mouth while you contemplated your life choices. But let's say your local barber was particularly progressive and decided that extraction wasn't the answer. Maybe he'd heard about new techniques from the great medical schools of Salerno or Bologna, where learned men were revolutionizing the field of medicine by reading ancient Greek texts and arguing about whether yellow bile or black bile was responsible for toothaches. These cutting-edge practitioners might attempt to clean out the infected tooth using thin metal instruments that looked suspiciously like modified knitting needles. The cleaning process involved digging into the infected pulp of your tooth with these primitive tools, scraping out the decayed matter while you experienced levels of pain that would make modern waterboarding seem like a relaxing spa treatment. There was no understanding of sterile technique, so these instruments were cleaned, if at all, by wiping them on a rag that had probably been used for everything from wound dressing to floor mopping. Infection wasn't a possibility, it was a guarantee. And speaking of infection, let's talk about what was actually happening inside your mouth while all this medieval dental artistry was taking place. That innocent little toothache you started with was caused by bacteria eating away at your tooth enamel and drilling down into the soft pulp inside. Once bacteria reached the pulp, they set up shop like microscopic Vikings, pillaging and burning everything in sight. Your tooth became a bacterial fortress, producing pus and toxins that your body desperately tried to fight off. But your medieval immune system was already fighting about 17 other battles. You had parasites from drinking contaminated water, malnutrition from your diet of rocks and sadness, and probably at least 3 diseases that wouldn't be identified for another 600 years. Your body's response to the tooth infection was essentially to throw up its hands and hope for the best. The infection would spread from your tooth into your jaw, creating abscesses that swelled your face into grotesque proportions. Medieval people called this the king's evil, or scrofula, depending on where it occurred, because apparently even their diseases needed royal titles. The abscess would fill with pus, creating pressure that felt like someone was slowly inflating a balloon inside your skull. The pain would radiate into your ear, your eye, your entire head, until you couldn't remember what it felt like to exist without agony. At this point, if you were still conscious and capable of rational thought, you might seek out more exotic treatments. Medieval medicine was nothing if not creative in its approaches to suffering. Some physicians recommended holding warm wine in your mouth, which sounds pleasant until you realize that medieval wine had the alcohol content of modern mouthwash and the hygiene standards of a stable. Others suggested chewing on special stones that were supposed to draw out the poison, though these stones were usually just random rocks that someone had declared magical. The more desperate patients might seek out traveling healers, who promised miraculous cures using secret knowledge passed down from ancient masters. These charlatans traveled from town to town with wagons full of mysterious potions, claiming to possess remedies that could cure everything from toothaches to demonic possession. Their treatments included drinking concoctions made from ground up animal parts, wearing amulets made from blessed metals, and reciting incantations that sounded impressively foreign. One popular remedy involved catching a live frog at midnight during a full moon, holding it against the infected tooth until it died, then burying the frog in consecrated ground while reciting specific prayers. The theory was that the frog would absorb the disease and carry it away to the afterlife. Patients would actually spend their savings on frogs, convinced that amphibian sacrifice was their ticket to dental salvation. Other treatments were even more elaborate. Some healers claimed that toothaches were caused by tiny worms that had taken up residence in your teeth. The cure involved creating a special fumigation chamber where you would inhale smoke made from burning herbs, animal dung, and various mysterious powders. The idea was that the smoke would either kill the worms or convince them to relocate to someone else's mouth. Patients would sit in these makeshift gas chambers, breathing in toxic fumes while their healers chanted and collected payment. The church, not to be outdone in the creative suffering department, offered its own solutions. Prayer was always the first recommendation, along with donations to the appropriate saints. Saint Apollonia was the patron saint of toothaches, having had all her teeth knocked out during her martyrdom, which made her uniquely qualified to understand dental suffering. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to visit her relics, convinced that proximity to her holy teeth would cure their earthly dental problems. Some monasteries specialized in dental miracles, claiming that their holy water or blessed oils could cure any tooth ailment. Desperate patients would drink gallons of this blessed water, not realizing that the monastery's well was probably contaminated with the same bacteria that were causing their problems in the first place. The monks, well-meaning but medically ignorant, would pray over patients while administering treatments that often made the infections worse. But let's return to our poor peasant with the increasingly serious tooth infection. By now, several weeks have passed since that first innocent twinge. The abscess in his jaw has grown to the size of a hen's egg, distorting his face so dramatically that children run away screaming when they see him. The infection has spread from his tooth into his jawbone, creating a condition called osteomyelitis, though he wouldn't know this term because it wouldn't be coined for another 500 years. The bacteria are now eating away at his jawbone itself, creating pockets of dead tissue that his body can't heal. His breath smells like rotting meat because, essentially, that's what it is. The infection is producing toxins that are slowly poisoning his entire system, causing fever, chills, and a general feeling that death might actually be preferable to consciousness. At this stage, even the most optimistic barber would probably recommend extraction, assuming he could figure out which tooth was causing the problem. Medieval diagnostic techniques were limited to asking, "Does this hurt?" while poking random teeth with pointed sticks. Often they would extract the wrong tooth entirely, leaving the infection to continue its merry rampage through the patient's skull. The extraction process at this advanced stage of infection was particularly horrifying. The infected tissue around the tooth would be soft and rotten, providing no anchor for the extraction tools. The barber would end up pulling out chunks of infected gum, pieces of jawbone, and occasionally parts of teeth that weren't even involved in the original problem. The patient would lose consciousness from pain, blood loss, or sheer terror, while the barber continued working with the dedication of a medieval construction worker who had been told the building wouldn't collapse. Even if the extraction was successful, the patient was left with a gaping wound in their mouth that was essentially an open invitation for new infections. The hole where the tooth used to be would become a breeding ground for bacteria, often leading to new abscesses that made the original toothache seem like a pleasant memory. Medieval wound care consisted of stuffing the hole with whatever was available, usually cloth that had been used for other purposes and hadn't been washed since the Crusades. The lucky patients would develop what medieval physicians called laudable pus, which was thick, white, and supposedly indicated that the body was winning its fight against infection. Unlucky patients developed thin, foul, smelling pus that indicated the infection was spreading into deeper tissues. Neither type of pus was particularly laudable by modern standards, but medieval medicine celebrated any sign that the patient wasn't immediately dead. Some patients developed a condition where the infection spread along their jawbone and into their neck, creating abscesses that would eventually burst through the skin. These external abscesses would drain pus and blood continuously, creating wounds that never healed properly. The patient would walk around with gaping holes in their face, trying to go about their daily business while literally rotting from the inside out. The smell alone was enough to make these patients social outcasts. Medieval people were accustomed to bad odors, living as they did in a world where personal hygiene was considered suspicious and possibly heretical. But the smell of advanced dental infection was something special, a combination of rotting flesh, bacterial toxins, and despair that could clear a room faster than news of plague outbreak. For those patients whose infection spread into their sinuses, the experience became even more delightful. The sinuses would fill with infected fluid, creating pressure that felt like someone was driving nails into their skull from the inside. They would blow their noses and produce streams of blood and pus, often mixed with fragments of infected tissue. Their eyes would swell shut, their voices would become thick and nasal, and their heads would pound with pain that made thinking impossible. Meanwhile, the systemic effects of the infection were taking their toll. The bacteria were releasing toxins into the bloodstream, causing what we now know as sepsis. Medieval patients would develop high fevers that alternated with bone-chilling cold. They would become delirious, hallucinating conversations with dead relatives or seeing demons dancing on the ceiling. Their hearts would race, trying to pump blood through a system that was essentially being poisoned from within. Some developed a condition where their blood wouldn't clot properly, leading to spontaneous bleeding from their gums, nose, and other orifices. They would wake up with blood on their pillows, having bled throughout the night without realizing it. Medieval physicians interpreted this as evidence that the evil humors were trying to escape the body, which was actually not entirely wrong, though their recommended treatments usually made things worse. The digestive system would shut down as the body focused all its energy on fighting the infection. Patients would lose their appetite entirely, which was probably fortunate since eating anything would cause excruciating pain as food particles contacted the infected areas. They would lose weight rapidly, becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed, looking like living skeletons with swollen faces. For patients who survived long enough, the infection might eventually spread to their brain, causing what medieval physicians called brain fever. Modern medicine would recognize this as meningitis or brain abscess. But medieval practitioners had no understanding of how infections could travel through the body. They would attribute the patient's increasingly bizarre behavior to demonic possession, calling for exorcists instead of physicians. The final stages of untreated dental infection were mercifully brief. The patient would slip into a coma as their brain swelled from infection and toxins. Their breathing would become shallow and irregular. Their skin would take on a greyish pallor that medieval people called the death colour. Family members would gather around, praying for their soul while secretly relieved that the suffering was almost over. Death would come from septic shock, as the infection overwhelmed the body's ability to maintain blood pressure and organ function. The patient would simply stop breathing, usually during the night, their body finally surrendering to bacteria that had started their conquest in a single tooth. But not everyone died, of course. Some patients were lucky enough to have their infections drain naturally, either through their gums or by breaking through the skin of their face or neck. These spontaneous drainages could sometimes save a life, allowing the pressure to release and giving the body a chance to fight off the remaining infection. Patients would wake up to find their pillow soaked with blood and pus, which was actually good news by medieval standards. Others survived through sheer, stubborn determination, and robust immune systems that managed to wall off the infection before it could spread throughout their body. These survivors were left with permanent damage to their jaws, faces scarred by abscesses, and gaps in their teeth where extractions had removed not just the infected tooth, but several of its neighbours. The survivors became walking advertisements for the dangers of dental problems. Their twisted faces and slurred speech served as reminders to their communities that toothaches were not to be taken lightly. Children would stare at these disfigured adults, unconsciously learning that dental pain could lead to a lifetime of suffering and social ostracism. Some survivors developed chronic infections that would flare up periodically for the rest of their lives. They would have good days when the swelling went down, and they could almost forget about their dental trauma, followed by bad days when the infection returned with a vengeance. These recurring infections would gradually wear down their bodies, leading to malnutrition, anemia, and eventually death from complications that might occur years after the original toothache. The psychological trauma was often as devastating as the physical damage. Patients who had survived advanced dental infections would develop phobias about anything touching their mouths. They would avoid certain foods, not because they couldn't chew them, but because the memory of pain made eating a terrifying experience. Some would refuse to speak more than absolutely necessary, having learned that moving their jaws could trigger waves of remembered agony. Medieval society had little sympathy for these dental refugees. The prevailing belief was that illness was either a punishment from God for sinful behavior or a test of faith that should be endured with Christian patience. Complaining about pain was seen as a sign of weak character, and seeking multiple treatments was often viewed as lack of faith in divine will. The economic impact of dental disease was catastrophic for medieval families. A breadwinner who couldn't work because of dental pain would quickly plunge his family into poverty. The cost of treatments, even ineffective ones, could wipe out a family's savings. Children would go hungry while their parents spent money on useless potions and fraudulent cures, desperately hoping that the next treatment would be the miracle they needed. Women faced additional challenges when dealing with dental problems. Medieval medicine generally considered women's bodies to be inferior versions of men's bodies, prone to more diseases and less capable of healing. Female patients were often dismissed as being hysterical or exaggerating their symptoms. Their pain was attributed to their inherently weaker nature or to moral failings specific to womankind. Pregnant women with dental infections faced impossible choices. The stress and toxins from the infection could cause miscarriages or birth defects, but the treatments available were equally dangerous to developing babies. Many women would endure months of agony rather than risk harming their unborn children, sometimes dying from infections that could have been treated if they hadn't been pregnant. Children with dental problems were often seen as being punished for the sins of their parents. Medieval theology taught that children could inherit the consequences of their parents' moral failures, so a child's toothache was evidence that the family needed to examine their spiritual life. This led to treatments that focused more on prayer and penance than on actual dental care. The social stigma attached to dental disease was particularly cruel. Medieval people believed that bad breath was a sign of moral corruption, so patients with dental infections were often shunned by their communities. They were excluded from social gatherings, avoided in the marketplace, and sometimes even banned from attending church services, since their odour was considered offensive to God. Professional consequences were equally severe. Craftsmen who couldn't perform their duties because of dental pain would lose their livelihoods. Merchants who couldn't speak clearly because of swollen faces would lose customers. Servants who couldn't eat properly would be dismissed for failing to maintain their strength for physical labour. The legal system offered no protection for dental disease sufferers. Medieval law didn't recognise illness as an excuse for failing to meet obligations. A peasant who couldn't pay his taxes because he had spent his money on dental treatments would still be held responsible for the debt. A worker who couldn't fulfill his contracts because of dental pain could be sued for breach of agreement. Marriage prospects for dental disease survivors were virtually non-existent. Medieval marriages were economic arrangements as much as romantic partnerships, and a spouse who was disfigured, couldn't work, or required ongoing medical expenses was seen as a liability rather than an asset. Young people who survived serious dental infections often remained single for life, unable to find partners willing to take on their medical baggage. The ripple effects extended to entire communities. When dental disease struck key members of a village, the entire social structure could be disrupted. A miller who couldn't work because of dental pain could leave an entire community without access to ground grain. A blacksmith who couldn't maintain his forge could leave farmers without tools for planting or harvest. Religious communities were not immune to dental devastation. Monks and nuns who developed serious dental infections faced the additional burden of maintaining their religious duties while dealing with debilitating pain. They were expected to attend all prayer services, maintain their fasting schedules, and continue their work in copying manuscripts or tending gardens, regardless of their physical condition. The medieval understanding of anatomy made dental problems particularly terrifying. Most people believed that their teeth were connected directly to their brains through mysterious channels that could carry infection upward. This wasn't entirely wrong, but their treatments were based on trying to block these imaginary channels rather than addressing the actual bacterial infection. Some physicians believed that dental problems were caused by tiny demons that had taken up residence in the mouth. These demons could only be expelled through elaborate rituals that involved burning specific combinations of herbs, reciting ancient incantations, and sometimes sacrificing small animals. Patients would submit to these demonic exorcisms, often paying substantial sums for ceremonies that accomplished nothing except emptying their purses. The seasonal nature of medieval life added another layer of complexity to dental problems. A toothache that developed during winter might be impossible to treat until spring, since travel to seek medical help could be treacherous or impossible. Patients would have to endure months of pain, knowing that help existed but was unreachable until the weather improved. Food preservation techniques of the medieval period often made dental problems worse. Salt-cured meats were so hard they could chip healthy teeth, while pickled vegetables were acidic enough to erode enamel that was already weakened by infection. Even when patients tried to eat soft foods to protect their damaged teeth, their options were limited to bread soaked in whatever liquid was available, usually ale or broth of questionable quality. The medieval workplace was particularly hostile to people with dental problems. Most occupations required either physical strength or clear speech, both of which could be compromised by dental disease. Laborers who couldn't bite through tough materials would be seen as useless. Merchants who couldn't speak clearly would lose customers who couldn't understand them. Even scribes who copied manuscripts could find their work affected if dental pain made it difficult to concentrate. Educational opportunities were non-existent for most medieval people, but those few who might have had access to learning would find their prospects destroyed by dental disease. Students who couldn't speak clearly couldn't participate in the oral examinations that were the primary method of academic assessment. Young people who showed promise as singers or speakers would find their talents destroyed by the facial deformities caused by advanced dental infections. The military implications of dental disease were significant in a world where every able-bodied man might be called to defend his community. Soldiers who couldn't bite through leather straps to secure their armor, couldn't blow horns to signal their units, or couldn't shout orders clearly were liabilities in battle. Many medieval armies would reject recruits who showed signs of dental problems, recognizing that dental disease could compromise military effectiveness. Medieval transportation was limited to walking, riding horses, or traveling in carts that had no suspension and offered no protection from the elements. A person with a serious dental infection faced a nightmare journey to seek medical help, with every bump in the road sending shockwaves of pain through their infected jaw. Many patients who might have survived with prompt treatment died simply because they couldn't endure the journey to find help. The psychological warfare aspect of dental disease was particularly cruel. Enemies who learned that a rival was suffering from dental problems would sometimes taunt them by eating hard foods loudly, demonstrating their ability to chew normally while their opponent suffered. In a world where physical capability was closely tied to social status, The inability to perform basic functions like eating became a source of public humiliation. Medieval festivals and celebrations often centered around food, making social participation impossible for people with serious dental problems. They would be excluded from harvest festivals, wedding feasts, and religious celebrations that marked the rhythm of community life. This social isolation compounded the physical suffering, creating a spiral of depression that made recovery even more difficult. The medieval judicial system sometimes used dental torture as a form of punishment or interrogation. Authorities who learned that a prisoner was already suffering from dental problems would exploit this vulnerability, knowing that even minor pressure on infected teeth could produce unbearable pain. This created a situation where dental disease could make a person more vulnerable to false confession or wrongful conviction. Trade relationships were also affected by dental disease. Merchants who couldn't negotiate clearly because of speech impediments caused by dental problems would find themselves at a disadvantage in business dealings. International traders who couldn't adapt their pronunciation to different languages and dialects would lose opportunities to expand their businesses. The inheritance laws of medieval Europe created additional hardships for families dealing with dental disease. Property and titles typically passed to the eldest male heir, but if that heir was incapacitated by dental infection, families faced legal battles over succession. Some noble families were torn apart by disputes over whether an heir who was disfigured by dental disease was still capable of managing family estates. Religious pilgrimage, a common response to serious illness, was particularly difficult for dental disease sufferers. The long journeys on foot, the poor food available at roadside inns, and the lack of medical facilities along pilgrimage routes made these spiritual journeys potential death sentences for people already weakened by infection. Medieval warfare often involved siege situations where defenders might be trapped in castles or walled cities for months at a time. During these sieges, food supplies would dwindle, and what remained would often be hard, preserved foods that were torture for people with dental problems. Defenders who couldn't eat properly would weaken faster than their comrades, potentially compromising the defense of their community. The craft guild system that organized medieval professions had no provisions for members who became incapacitated by illness. A master craftsman who could no longer perform his trade because of dental problems would lose his guild membership, along with all the social and economic benefits that membership provided. His apprentices would be left without proper training, and his family would lose their primary source of income. Agricultural work, the backbone of medieval economy, was particularly difficult for people with dental problems. Farmers who couldn't eat properly would lack the energy for heavy physical labor. Those who couldn't speak clearly would have trouble coordinating work with their neighbors during crucial times like planting and harvest. The seasonal nature of farming meant that missing these critical periods could result in starvation for entire families. Medieval medicine's emphasis on balance and moderation created additional suffering for dental patients. Physicians would often recommend reducing food intake to restore the body's natural balance, not understanding that patients with dental infections were already malnourished because eating was so painful. These recommendations would accelerate the patient's decline, making recovery even less likely. The medieval understanding of contagion was limited and often incorrect, but people correctly observed that dental problems seemed to spread within families. They attributed this to moral corruption, being passed from parents to children, rather than understanding that shared living conditions, diet, and hygiene practices were responsible for the pattern. This led to entire families being stigmatized when one member developed serious dental disease. Weather patterns could dramatically affect the course of dental infections. Cold, damp conditions common in medieval Europe would worsen the pain of dental problems, while hot weather could accelerate the spread of infection. Patients would find their condition varying with the seasons, getting worse during winter months when they were trapped indoors with poor ventilation and limited access to fresh food. The medieval legal concept of acts of God meant that natural disasters, including illness, were not considered anyone's responsibility. This left dental disease sufferers without legal recourse when their condition was worsened by negligent treatment or when their illness prevented them from fulfilling legal obligations. They had no way to seek compensation for damages caused by incompetent medical care. Educational institutions like monasteries and cathedral schools produced most of medieval Europe's literate population, but these institutions had strict rules about physical appearance and behavior. Students or monks who developed serious dental problems might be expelled from their communities, not because they couldn't perform their intellectual duties, but because their appearance or odor violated community standards. The medieval communication system relied heavily on traveling messengers who carried news and goods between communities. Messengers who developed dental problems that affected their speech would find themselves unable to work, cutting off communication links between isolated communities. This could have serious consequences during times of war or crisis, when rapid communication was essential for survival. Medieval music was primarily vocal, with instrumental music playing a secondary role. Musicians who developed dental problems that affected their ability to sing or play wind instruments would lose their livelihoods. In a world where entertainment options were limited, the loss of musical talent due to dental disease was felt throughout entire communities. The medieval textile industry employed large numbers of people in various stages of cloth production, from spinning thread to dyeing finished fabrics. Many of these processes required workers to use their teeth as tools, biting through threads or holding materials while their hands performed other tasks. Workers who developed dental problems would find themselves unable to perform these basic functions. Medieval construction projects, from simple houses to massive cathedrals, required workers who could communicate clearly with their colleagues and perform precise physical tasks. Masons who couldn't call out measurements clearly, or carpenters who couldn't grip tools properly because of facial swelling caused by dental infections would find themselves unemployable. The medieval system of apprenticeship depended on master craftsmen passing their knowledge to younger workers through years of hands-on training. Masters who developed dental problems that interfered with their ability to speak clearly or demonstrate techniques would be unable to train the next generation of workers, disrupting entire industries. Medieval navigation, whether on land or sea, relied heavily on oral tradition and verbal communication between travelers. Navigators who couldn't speak clearly because of dental problems would be unable to share crucial information about routes, hazards, or destinations. This could lead to travelers becoming lost or encountering dangerous situations. The medieval diplomatic system required ambassadors and negotiators who could speak clearly and present themselves impressively to foreign courts. Diplomats who developed disfiguring dental problems would find themselves unable to represent their lords effectively, potentially damaging important political relationships. Medieval scientific advancement, such as it was, depended on scholars who could debate ideas verbally and teach students through oral instruction. Natural philosophers who developed speech impediments caused by dental disease would find their careers ended, slowing the already glacial pace of scientific progress. The medieval system of trial by ordeal sometimes involved tests that specifically targeted people with dental problems. Accused persons might be required to chew and swallow blessed bread or hold heated objects in their mouths. Those who already suffered from dental disease would be more likely to fail these tests, leading to wrongful convictions. Medieval monasteries served as hospitals, schools, and centers of learning, but they also had strict rules about personal hygiene and community behavior. Monks or nuns who developed dental problems that produced offensive odors or interfered with their ability to participate in communal prayers might be expelled from their religious communities. The medieval concept of courtly love and romantic poetry celebrated physical beauty and graceful speech. Nobles who developed dental problems that disfigured their faces or slurred their speech would find themselves excluded from courtly society, losing not only romantic opportunities but also political and economic connections. Medieval merchant families often arranged marriages to create business partnerships between different commercial enterprises. Young people who developed serious dental problems would become unmarriageable, disrupting carefully planned business alliances and leaving their families without important commercial connections. The medieval understanding of human anatomy was based largely on ancient Greek and Roman texts that contained significant errors. Physicians believed that teeth were connected to various organs through invisible channels, leading to treatments that focused on these imaginary connections rather than the actual bacterial infections causing the problems. Medieval pharmacy was a mixture of herbal knowledge, folk remedies, and pure superstition. Apothecaries would compound elaborate mixtures of dozens of ingredients, many of which were either useless or harmful. Patients would spend fortunes on these complex medications, often making their conditions worse while impoverishing their families. The medieval concept of professional responsibility was limited, and medical practitioners faced few consequences for failed treatments. Patients who were harmed by incompetent dental care had little recourse, since the prevailing belief was that illness was ultimately in God's hands and human physicians were merely instruments of divine will. Medieval record keeping was limited and inconsistent, making it impossible to track patterns of dental disease or evaluate the effectiveness of different treatments. Each practitioner worked in isolation, unable to learn from the experiences of others or build on accumulated knowledge about dental care. The medieval system of patronage meant that medical practitioners depended on wealthy sponsors for their livelihoods. Physicians who failed to cure their patrons' dental problems might lose not only that patient, but their entire source of income, creating pressure to promise miraculous cures that couldn't be delivered. And so our peasant, our perfectly ordinary medieval person with a perfectly ordinary toothache, becomes a casualty of an age that had all the suffering of human existence, but none of the knowledge needed to address it effectively. His death certificate, if such things had existed, would have listed the cause as God's will, or fever, never mentioning the tiny bacterial invasion that started it all. The medieval approach to dental disease was a perfect storm of ignorance, superstition, and well-meaning incompetence that turned minor problems into life-threatening emergencies. In a world where a small cut could lead to death from infection, where childbirth was a gamble with mortality, where winter meant months of malnutrition and disease, a simple toothache was just one more way the universe demonstrated its complete indifference to human suffering. The tragic irony is that many of the deaths caused by dental disease were completely preventable, even with medieval technology. Basic hygiene, proper nutrition, and rudimentary understanding of infection could have saved countless lives. But medieval society was too busy dealing with wars, plagues, and the daily struggle for survival to develop systematic approaches to public health. So the next time you complain about a dental appointment, remember our medieval ancestors who faced similar problems with nothing but prayer alcohol and rusty pliers. Remember that the fluoride in your water, the antibiotics in your medicine cabinet, and the anesthesia at your dentist's office represent centuries of human progress, built on the suffering of people who died from problems we now consider minor inconveniences. The medieval toothache was more than just pain. It was a death sentence disguised as a dental problem. A bacterial time bomb wrapped in the ignorance of an age that had forgotten the medical knowledge of the ancient world and had not yet developed the scientific method that would eventually replace superstition with understanding. It was a reminder that in the grand scheme of human history, our current medical miracles are very recent developments, and that the line between civilization and barbarism is often as thin as the enamel on our teeth. The psychological horror of medieval dental disease extended far beyond the physical pain. Patients would lie awake at night, listening to their own heartbeat pounding in their infected jaw, feeling each pulse as a wave of agony that reminded them they were still alive to suffer. The constant pain would drive people to desperate measures, leading them to seek out increasingly exotic and dangerous treatments as their desperation grew. Some patients would travel hundreds of miles to visit sacred springs that were rumored to have healing properties. They would drink the mineral, rich water, bathe in it, and sometimes even gargle with it, not knowing that many of these springs were contaminated with the same bacteria that were causing their problems. The journey itself often worsened their condition, as the stress of travel and exposure to new pathogens compromised their already weakened immune systems. Medieval dental disease created a thriving black market in fake remedies and fraudulent cures. Traveling merchants would sell bottles of miracle water, blessed by distant saints, powdered horn from mythical creatures, and elaborate mechanical devices that promised to extract evil spirits from infected teeth. These charlatans preyed on desperate people who would pay any price for the hope of relief, often taking their victims' life savings in exchange for worthless trinkets. The social dynamics of medieval dental disease were particularly cruel during times of celebration. Wedding feasts, harvest festivals, and religious holidays all centered around communal eating, making these joyous occasions torture for people with dental problems. They would sit at the edges of celebrations, watching others enjoy foods they couldn't eat, listening to laughter they couldn't join, isolated by their suffering in moments when community bonds were strongest. Medieval entertainment often involved storytelling, singing, and verbal wit, all of which became impossible for people whose dental infections had affected their speech. Court jesters, traveling minstrels, and village storytellers who developed dental problems would lose not just their livelihoods, but their entire social identity. In cultures that valued clever wordplay and verbal skill, the inability to speak clearly was a form of social death that preceded physical death. The medieval understanding of time and mortality made dental disease particularly terrifying. People lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, expecting to follow the same seasonal rhythms as their ancestors. A dental infection that disrupted this predictable pattern felt like a fundamental violation of natural order, a sign that the universe itself had turned hostile. Regional variations in medieval dental care created additional suffering. Areas that had maintained some connection to ancient Roman medical knowledge might have slightly better treatments, while isolated regions might rely entirely on folk remedies that had been passed down through generations of ignorance. Patients who lived in the wrong place at the wrong time faced even worse odds of survival. The medieval climate was entering what historians now call the Little Ice Age, with colder winters and shorter growing seasons that made malnutrition more common. Malnourished people were more susceptible to dental disease, and dental disease made it harder to eat the limited food that was available, creating a deadly cycle that trapped entire communities in declining health. Medieval warfare created unique challenges for dental disease sufferers. During sieges, defenders would be trapped with limited food supplies that often consisted of hard, preserved foods that were torture for infected teeth. Attackers who developed dental problems during long campaigns would find themselves unable to maintain their strength for battle, making them liabilities to their comrades. The medieval legal system's emphasis on physical appearance and verbal testimony made dental disease particularly devastating for anyone involved in legal proceedings. Witnesses who couldn't speak clearly were considered unreliable. Defendants whose faces were disfigured by infection were presumed guilty based on their appearance, and lawyers who developed speech impediments would lose their ability to practice their profession. Medieval taxation systems often demanded payment in kind, rather than money, requiring peasants to deliver specific quantities of grain, livestock, or other goods to their lords. Farmers who couldn't work effectively because of dental problems would still be required to meet these obligations, forcing them to give up food their families needed for survival. The medieval church's teaching about suffering and redemption created additional psychological torture for dental disease patients. They were told that their pain was either punishment for sin or a test of faith, making them feel guilty for seeking relief. This spiritual dimension of suffering meant that dental patients faced not just physical pain, but existential crisis about their relationship with God. Medieval medical education, such as it was, focused on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. Physicians trained by reading ancient texts and debating abstract principles, never actually examining patients or observing the results of different treatments. This created a medical establishment that was completely divorced from clinical reality, leading to treatments that sounded scholarly but accomplished nothing. The medieval system of medical licensing was minimal and inconsistent. Anyone could claim to be a healer simply by demonstrating knowledge of medical terminology or by gaining the endorsement of local authorities. This created a marketplace flooded with incompetent practitioners who were convinced of their own expertise despite having no actual medical training. Medieval patients had no way to evaluate the qualifications of medical practitioners, leading them to choose healers based on charisma, reputation, or price rather than actual competence. The most confident charlatans often attracted the most patients, while genuinely knowledgeable healers who admitted the limitations of their abilities were ignored. The medieval understanding of pain was fundamentally different from modern concepts. Pain was seen as a spiritual experience rather than a medical symptom, something to be endured rather than treated. This philosophical approach to suffering meant that effective pain management was not even considered a legitimate goal of medical treatment. Medieval record keeping was so poor that the same ineffective treatments would be tried repeatedly on different patients, with no systematic effort to learn from failures. Each generation of healers would rediscover the same useless remedies, convinced they were making breakthrough discoveries that had never been attempted before. The medieval economy's dependence on physical labor meant that dental disease could destroy entire family economies. A father who couldn't work because of dental pain would plunge his family into poverty, but the costs of seeking treatment would make that poverty even more severe. Families faced impossible choices between bankruptcy and watching their loved ones die in agony. Medieval dental disease created cascading health problems that physicians couldn't understand or treat. The malnutrition caused by inability to eat would lead to scurvy, anemia, and immune deficiency. The chronic pain would cause insomnia and depression. The social isolation would worsen mental health. Physicians would treat each symptom separately, never understanding that they were all connected to the original dental infection. The medieval fascination with astrology meant that many treatments were timed according to planetary alignments rather than medical necessity. Patients might be told to wait weeks for the right celestial conditions before beginning treatment, allowing infections to worsen while they waited for Mars to enter the proper house or for the Moon to reach the correct phase. Medieval surgical techniques were crude and dangerous, but they were especially hazardous when applied to dental problems. Surgeons who attempted to drain abscesses or remove infected tissue would often cause more damage than the original infection. The lack of proper instruments, sterile techniques, and anatomical knowledge meant that surgical intervention was often fatal. The medieval belief in sympathetic magic led to treatments that focused on symbolic rather than practical approaches. Patients would be given amulets made from the teeth of healthy animals, told to sleep with their heads pointing in specific directions, or instructed to wear clothing that had been blessed by religious authorities. These symbolic treatments gave patients false hope, while their actual conditions continued to deteriorate. Medieval dietary restrictions imposed by religious authorities could worsen dental disease. Fasting periods that limited food intake would weaken patients who were already malnourished because of their dental problems. Religious prohibitions against certain foods might eliminate the few soft, nutritious options that dental patients could still consume. The medieval emphasis on community conformity meant that people who behaved differently because of illness were viewed with suspicion. Dental patients who avoided social gatherings, ate differently, or spoke strangely were sometimes accused of witchcraft or demonic possession. This added the terror of persecution to the agony of disease. Medieval childbirth practices meant that women who developed dental infections during pregnancy faced impossible choices. The stress and toxins from dental disease could cause miscarriages or birth defects, but the treatments available were equally dangerous to developing babies. Many women would endure months of agony rather than risk harming their unborn children. The medieval understanding of heredity led to the belief that dental problems were punishment for ancestral sins. Entire families would be stigmatized when one member developed serious dental disease, as communities assumed that moral corruption was being passed down through generations. This genetic guilt added shame to suffering. Medieval trade routes that connected Europe to the rest of the world paradoxically made dental disease worse in some ways. New foods imported from distant lands often contained unfamiliar bacteria that European immune systems couldn't handle. Sugar, when it became available, was so expensive that people would consume it in concentrated doses that devastated their teeth. The medieval guild system's emphasis on maintaining trade secrets meant that potentially effective treatments were kept hidden within small groups of practitioners. A guild member who discovered a useful remedy might teach it only to his immediate family or closest apprentices, preventing the spread of medical knowledge that could have saved lives. Medieval urban planning created perfect conditions for the spread of infectious diseases that could complicate dental problems. Cities were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and contaminated with human and animal waste. Dental patients who moved to cities seeking better medical care often found their infections worsened by exposure to urban pathogens. The medieval concept of medical ethics was primitive and inconsistent. Practitioners faced few consequences for harmful treatments, and patients had little recourse when medical care made their conditions worse. This created a medical environment where dangerous experimentation was common and patient safety was rarely considered. Medieval transportation technology meant that seriously ill patients often couldn't reach medical care before their conditions became fatal. A person with a spreading dental infection might live only days' walk from effective treatment, but be unable to make the journey because of pain, weakness, or weather conditions. The medieval monetary system's reliance on barter rather than standardized currency made medical care financially complicated. Patients might need to trade livestock, grain, or handmade goods for treatment, but dental disease often prevented them from producing the goods they needed to pay for care. Medieval dental disease, in its full medieval context, was thus not merely a medical problem, but a complete catastrophe that destroyed lives, families, and communities through a perfect storm of ignorance, superstition, and societal dysfunction. It serves as a reminder that progress in human welfare is neither inevitable nor permanent, and that the medical miracles we take for granted today represent centuries of accumulated knowledge built on the suffering of those who came before us.